All right. Well, good morning. It's good to see you. I'm very glad that you could be here with us for another Richland County Inklings event. My name is Dylan Rowland, and I am very privileged to be here, and I'm thankful for the work that this group is doing and to have been at the foundational level of the Richland County Inklings. But this morning, we'll be talking a little bit about the book Till We Have Faces from C.S. Lewis. And I have passed out an outline there for your review to work through it with me and then to take home with you if you would like to think further about these things. But the title of this is called Divine Hiddenness and Babbling Fools, Addressing the Problem of Evil Until We Have Faces. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a moment. But first, just to give you a brief introduction, I am the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church here in Mansfield. And again, I've been at the ground level of the Richland County Inklings. I'm very thankful for Caleb and Joe, who have also partnered with me for this kind of thing. And we've had several events now, and I think for what we're trying to do, we've typically had good turnouts and good discussions on various issues and topics within the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams, and so forth. And so we're going to return to Lewis today. So the format is a brief lecture followed by time of question and answers. So I'd encourage you as we make our way through, please jot down any questions, comments that you might have. And if there are at any point through this, you just have a question for clarification, please stop me and we can talk about it. But I look forward to this discussion. So the purpose then this morning is to examine C.S. Lewis's thought Until We Have Faces as a means of providing insight for answering the issue of divine hiddenness, but within the broader context of what is typically known as the problem of evil. Now, as we approach this, I want to be very clear that I'm coming at this as a Christian. I adopt the same kind of assumptions that Lewis himself adopted as a Christian, but I also come at this in a very real sense as an amateur. I am an amateur, but I really have a deep love and appreciation for good literature, of which I think C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, and others wrote. So please keep in mind, I am very much an amateur here. I have a deep love for these things. So, Till We Have Faces. Out of curiosity, have we all read this book? Has there been anyone that has not read this book? And that's okay. I think I would encourage you, because typically when we think about this book, when you talk to people who've read it, there is a sort of a common consensus that it is a little confusing and sort of not sure what Lewis was after here. In fact, that was my opinion of the book as well. When I read through it for a first time, my thoughts on the matter was kind of like, what did I just read? I'm not quite sure what this is about, but Till We Have Faces is a phenomenal story. There's so much in this story to unpack and to apply to life. But as an introduction to the book, this was Lewis's final novel, which was published in 1956, and it was published with a very modest reception. So a lot of people then thought the same way as people now. They're not quite sure what to do with it. But interestingly, Lewis thought it was his best work. And that makes sense. I think after a lifetime of producing good nonfiction and fictional material, Lewis writes this final novel, says this is his best work, and I think if we spend time looking through the work, working through it together, that we would come to the same kind of conclusion, that it's at least in his top 3. But Lewis thought himself that it was his best work. Now, Till We Have Faces is a retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth. And so if you are familiar or not familiar with these old myths, in the original Cupid and Psyche myth, it is a story about Venus, who is jealous of Psyche's beauty, Psyche being immortal, but this jealousy leads to a union between Psyche and Cupid. And the story is very fascinating. And the story, as I understand it, Psyche, who is a mortal, can only meet with Cupid because Cupid is a god at certain times and in certain ways. But as the story progresses, Psyche is taken up, if you will, into godhood and is able to fully enjoy the union that she has with Cupid. So this is a retelling of that story from Lewis's perspective. And as you read through this work, you'll note that there are several main characters that appear throughout. The main character of the story, the main protagonist, is Orual, and she is a queen of the kingdom of Glome. And the story takes place of her childhood and relationship to her sisters. Her one sister, named Redeval, is described as being a very vain person. She likes shallow things. She's very shallow after the popularity of the world, if you will. And then there is Psyche. Psyche is her youngest sister, her half-sister. And Psyche becomes to Orual like a child, like her own child. But Psyche is beautiful. And for her young age, she is depicted as being very wise and gentle, sort of the true picture of beauty and blessedness. And this character's distinctions are going to be very important for how the story develops and how the plot continues. And what's interesting about Orual is that she is known as the Veiled Queen. And in the story, she is described even by herself as being very ugly. But as the story goes, she is constantly veiled, and as a queen, that's how people come to know her, as the Veiled Queen. But her being the Veiled Queen is a very important attribute of this character, as we'll see in just a moment's time. Now, the sisters were taught by a man called the Fox. The Fox is a wise sage, and he teaches the sisters. And he teaches them about myth and, at the time, the educational standards. But what's fascinating about the Fox is he becomes, if anyone has read Dante's comedy, we know that Dante in the Inferno and Purgatorio is led by Virgil. Virgil is a guide for Dante, leading him through hell and purgatory. The Fox is like this to the sisters. He is like their Virgil, leading and guiding the sisters. Lewis employs him this way. And also you have the sisters' father, who is in the majority of the story. He is the king of Glome. This man is the picture of disordered passions. This is a man who lives by the senses, who is greedy and selfish, and has a very disordered way of loving his people, his daughters, and the kingdom. And then Bardia. Bardia is a faithful servant of the king and becomes a faithful friend to Orual, but he is the picture of an ordered man. You want to know what virtue is like, we get it from Bardia. Bardia is committed to the king, to the kingdom. He is committed to his wife and to his children. And this is, interestingly becomes a scenario of love between Orual and Bardia. Bardia, who is faithful to his wife, Orual, who is upset about this. But these are the main characters that appear throughout the story until we have faces, and they all represent various depictions of the kinds of people and their various relationship to virtue. So, this will be important as we discuss the problem of evil, how the plot develops, but the themes that are present in the book is definitely the question of love. What does it mean to actually love, to really love another, and love in its various contexts? Jealousy is another very important theme. Joy, longing. And these two, joy and longing, I think are at the heart not only of this book, but they are at the heart of C.S. Lewis as a whole. C.S. Lewis had a few ideas, and those few ideas come consistently through in all of his writing. C.S. Lewis, if you read his own autobiography called Surprised by Joy, joy to him is accompanied with a sense of longing for completion, longing for fulfillment. And joy and longing come as very major themes in this story. And it's really fascinating as a side note. We know that C.S. Lewis married later in life, and his wife was named Joy. And so I think, as I understand it, that was a long time running joke from his friends. After he had written his autobiography called Surprised by Joy, then Joy David comes along, and his friends were like, he was surprised by joy. So it is kind of a fulfilling thing, I think. But another major theme of this book is an accusation of the gods. This is where the theme of the problem of evil, or what we will call divine hiddenness, comes in. Orwell, who is the main character of this story, begins by accusing the gods of being hidden and not answering, not being there. And so as a result, when we deal with the question of the accusation of the gods, by implication, questions of faith, belief, and skepticism come in. And this is why I think this book is very practical in terms of addressing our hearts as well. We as human individuals all deal with disordered passions, question of love and jealousy, joy and longing. We all have these experiences, and we all desire for them to be ordered rightly and properly. And I would even submit to you that this is at the foundation of diagnosing all of the problems that we have, even in our world today, that we are creatures of longing and desire fulfillment. But it's where we find that longing to be fulfilled is where the problem is. So I think it's eminently practical for us, and not just the world we live in, but for us. We too are creatures that long for these things. We too are creatures that deal with evil, struggle with longing, seeking for joy, and those sorts of things. And so ultimately, when I was reading through Till We Have Faces the second time, as I probably come to a little bit clearer understanding of what was happening, I got to the second to last chapter. And at the end of that chapter, seeing the conclusion of it, it absolutely broke me. It absolutely broke me because I think, for the first time in reading this story, I saw a picture of myself. And that's what I think the brilliance of this is. What Lewis writes about here is an experience that we all have. So I'd encourage you, if you've not yet read Till We Have Faces, or if you have read it, reread it, think about these things, especially in light of some of the things that we'll talk about today. Now, before we move on, are there any questions at this point? Any comments about this introductory information? Okay. All right. Well, again, the theme is divine hiddenness and addressing the problem of evil. And so on your outline, if you look at number 3, we're going to look briefly at a summary of the so-called problem of evil. Now, for today, I think there are 3 subdivisions of this that are important for us. The first is what's called the logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil. And the logical problem of evil is this: that the existence of an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God is logically incompatible with the existence of evil. Now, this kind of argument says that this kind of God is logically incompatible with the existence of evil. If God is all good, if he is all powerful, and if he is all knowing, then he would want to do away with evil. He could do away with evil. But the fact that God does not seem to want to do away with evil, or does not do away with evil, perhaps he doesn't exist. It's logically incompatible. If you believe in a God, it cannot be this God. Now, a major proponent of this logical problem of evil is a philosopher of religion named J.L. Mackie. And he was a 20th century proponent of this, and it's a powerful argument. If we think about the reality of evil in the world that we live in, and of course we watch the news, we read the Facebook pages, we see all that's going on in the world, and sometimes, I think if we're honest, we're tempted to ask the question, is it possible for a all good, all loving, and all powerful God to exist in light of the very egregious things that we see. But this argument says it is logically incompatible. This God cannot exist in light of evil. Now, there's a second version of the problem of evil. It is called the evidential problem of evil. And this is a probabilistic argument. Okay? And this probabilistic argument says that God's existence is possible, but because of the reality of evil, God's existence is highly improbable. Right? But because evil exists, God's existence is highly improbable. And here in this argument, the emphasis is placed on the intensity of the kind of evil that exists in the world. It focuses on the amount, or even perhaps more potently, pointlessness of evil in the world. William Rowe was also a 20th century philosopher and proponent of the evidential problem of evil, and he gives what is called the Bambi thought experiment. And this highlights the sort of severity, the intensity, but really the pointlessness of evil in the world. And so he asked the question, something like this: think about a forest fire. Right? In a forest fire, there are many animals that eventually will die. So think about that small deer, Bambi perhaps, that does not escape the fire, but is lying on the ground, suffering with egregious pain, not yet dead. And there are no humans, there are no other thinking creatures around to witness this. What is the point of that? It is pointless evil, suffering, intense, and the amount of suffering is just egregious for this significance. Now again, I admit, this is a touching kind of argument. But because of these kinds of things, on top of the intentional kinds of evil that we see in the world, murder, theft, everything else, it's probably the case that God does not exist. Because again, if God is all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, why doesn't he stop this? Especially pointless kind of evil. You see how that argument works? Now, these are powerful arguments. And I think they're powerful not simply because they seem logical, but because they hit at the heart of what we all feel. We feel a longing for the resolution of these kinds of things. We recognize them, we hate to think about this kind of evil, but when we do, we long for the resolution. We long for justice, right? So it hits something in the heart of man. But nevertheless, these are major arguments that have been raised against belief, at least in the Christian God. Now that brings us to then really one of the main themes in Till We Have Faces, and that is the problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of divine hiddenness. Now this problem is a particular application of the problem of evil, but it concerns God's apparent absence. If he does exist, why does he not make himself known? Now you see, this is a logical implication from A and B. You have the problem of evil, the question of God's existence, particularly in 3b, if God does exist, why doesn't he make himself known? If he is powerful, wise, and good, why doesn't he make himself known? But what's interesting about this is very much present in the biblical literature. In the Bible, particularly in the Psalms, this kind of problem comes over very explicitly. For example, in Psalm 10, verses 1 and 2, the psalmist, in crying out to God, says, "Why do you stand afar off, Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? The wicked in his pride persecutes the poor. Let them be caught in the plots which they have devised." Again, we can understand this. Even if we are religious believers, we can understand this. In light of the evil that exists in the world, and perhaps in light of the suffering that we have faced, have there not been times where we say, "God, where are you? Why do you hide your face from me? Why do you stand so far off?" And you see this again in other places in the Bible. We think about the book of Job. Job, for example, is a very clear example of this. And in the first chapter of Job, we see what happens to Job's family, to his livelihood, indeed, as he suffers in his own body. And really, the rest of Job takes place as conversations discussing these kinds of issues, right? We see this in one sense, even in Jesus' ministry. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And he prays to the Father, take this cup from me, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Now, Jesus doesn't question the presence of the Father, but the suffering and the agony is there, right? So we see this as a significant problem, not only in the biblical literature, but in good stories like Till We Have Faces. And this is a problem that we all probably face, right? We've probably asked these kinds of questions at some point in our lives. So this is a very brief overview of the problem of evil in a couple of its formulations, and then specifically the problem of divine hiddenness. But hopefully you can see how applicable these questions are, right? How applicable these questions are. And it's in light of these kinds of questions that I think Till We Have Faces begins to give us helpful counsel in thinking about these kinds of things. Now, it probably doesn't answer the entire question, but I think it goes deep. And I think if we meditate on these themes and how the story develops, it will give us a way to contemplate and digest the problem of evil, and particularly the problem of divine hiddenness. So are there any questions about the problem of evil in its couple of formulations here? Any comments? Yeah.
How do the objections conceive of evil as pointless? What do they mean by it?
Well, so again, the example that we gave is in the Bambi thought experiment, right? So here you have an animal in a forest fire that is suffering from being burned severely and will eventually die. But there is no seeming point to it from that perspective, right? There's no human that caused it. There's no human around to even analyze it. Just that a baby deer in the woods at this point could be suffering egregious pain from a fire that was naturally caused. It just seems pointless, especially if you have an all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing God that could have prevented it. It just seems pointless. So, for example, some answers to this question have been, well, God uses evil for character formation. Soul-making theodicy is what that's called. In this case, what would be the soul-making of a deer suffering egregious pain in the woods, burning to death? How does that benefit me in terms of making me trust God more or something like that? So that's the kind of thing they mean when they say pointless. It's just pointless suffering. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do, but I don't want to.
Please, no.
No, it's probably coming up later, so I don't want to.
Okay. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay. So let's jump in then to Till We Have Faces. And this is number 4, Divine Hiddenness and the Problem of Evil in Till We Have Faces. So again, the book opens with a complaint by the main character, Orwell. As she is queen, she's reflecting on her life, and she is giving an account of how all of her life has gone to this point. And this is what we read in the beginning, the opening complaint. Orwell says, I will write in this book what no one who has happiness would dare to write. And I think it's fascinating, right? No one who is happy would dare to write the things I'm about to write. I will accuse the gods, especially the God who lives on the gray mountain. That is, I will tell all he has done to me from the very beginning, as if I were making my complaint of him before a judge. But there is no judge between gods and men, and the God of the mountain will not answer me. This is the opening complaint. I will accuse the gods, especially the God who lives on the gray mountain. This one particular God who lives on the gray mountain. And notice that very last sentence. But there is no judge between gods and men, and the God of the mountain will not answer me. This is the problem with divine hiddenness. I'm lodging my complaint. I've prayed, but the God will not answer me. He's hidden. Why is he hidden? So the problem which led Orual to write this complaint is that her youngest sister, Psyche, who was a picture of true beauty and blessedness, was sacrificed to the god of the mountain. In the story, Psyche becomes accused of transgressing Ungit's space, and Ungit being the god or the goddess of the people of Glome. Psyche's beauties far surpassed Ungit, or Aphrodite, known in another name, and because of this, Psyche had to be sacrificed to the god of the mountain, who was the son of Aphrodite. Now, Orual struggles with this, of course, and in her mind, to be sacrificed to the god of the mountain means that she will be killed, slaughtered, eaten. And of course, in her mind, because she loves Psyche so much, she cannot let this happen. Why would the gods do this? If they are for our benefit, why would they let this happen? And you can see how the logical and evidential problems of evil apply in this kind of scenario. Well, if the gods are good, if they are loving and wise, why would they do this? Okay? Now, what's fascinating about this is there is this beautiful conversation that happens between Orual and Psyche. After Psyche realizes that she is 24 hours from being sacrificed to the god of the mountain, Orual comes in to talk with Psyche to convince her to escape. And Psyche looks at Orual and says, yeah, but what if we had the wrong idea? What if the god on the mountain won't eat me up? What if the god on the mountain won't slaughter me? But what if being sacrificed, it means being given to him as in a marriage? And then she looks up to see the gray mountain in the distance, and she has this beautiful elaboration on, Orual, when we look at that mountain, this is the place of beauty. It is the place where beauty itself comes from. Haven't you ever wanted to go to the place where beauty is from? I've always longed to go to the mountain. Haven't you? And Orual, of course, thinks this is utterly ridiculous. And she becomes very angry and very upset with Psyche. And because of this, there is tension and ultimately a split between the characters. And Psyche is taken to the gray mountain, where she is sacrificed, given to the god of the mountain. And then Orual begins the process of going to give her a proper burial. But here we see the struggle that Orual begins to face. She's personally suffering. And this is the problem of evil. Gods, why don't you answer me? Why can't you do something about this? Why do you have to be so nasty to us mortals? And an interesting conversation between Bardia and Orual, which I find fascinating if you think about it. Bardia says to Orual, after Psyche is sacrificed, I wonder, do the gods know what it feels like to be a man? Think about this question. Do the gods know what it's like to be a man? I find it interesting in light of Lewis's Christianity. In fact, traditional Christian teaching says, yes, God knows what it's like to be a man. It's fascinating. But nevertheless, we see that Orual begins to struggle with these very problems. The problem of evil, divine hiddenness, and she doesn't understand why this has happened. So that's the problem. Orual's suffering. So we come to number 5. Addressing divine hiddenness and the problem of evil until we have faces. Now, the purpose here, as we think about Orual's suffering, what that means for the logical problem, the evidential problem of evil and divine hiddenness, the purpose here is to give you a preliminary study for the purpose of provoking you to further meditation. I really do think that these are important questions because if we haven't, we will suffer. We will experience hardships, great difficulties, and I imagine that for all of us, we will at some point in our lives experience difficulty beyond imagination. I am married. I have 5 children. And there will come a day when I will be separated from my family in death. That is a reality. And it is a difficult reality. I have friends whom I love. I've had friends whom I've loved that I have been separated from in death. Unspeakable tragedies will befall us in this world. So we should not be naive. But that is all the more reason why these things matter. How we begin to think about this in light of, as Lewis says, the gods. So, to provoke further meditation. Now, in the story, Orwell lodges this complaint. And towards the end of the story, she comes to a conclusion. So after the story is over, she comes to this conclusion. I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? Now, as I interpret this, Orwell is saying something like this. From our perspective, from our finite human perspectives, when we interpret the silence of the gods as being maniacal and evil, it is a fundamental misunderstanding about their silence. Orwell concludes, I've misunderstood. And she says, secondly, I ended my first book with the words, no answer. When she lodged the complaint, the first part of the book, she concludes with the words, no answer. They don't answer. They're not going to answer. But notice what she says here. I now know, Lord, why you utter no answer. And here's the key. You are yourself the answer. Before your face, questions die away. This, in my humble opinion, is the whole ballgame. Why does God not answer? It's because He is the answer. Before the face of God, all questions die away. And I'm personally convinced, that when we see God face to face, we will not ask questions. Either good or bad. We will not ask questions. This is at the heart of beginning to answer, I think, the problem of evil from the perspective of longing and desiring to be answered and to be fulfilled. Why do the gods not answer? Because they are the answer. Or in this case, for Lewis, he's giving us a story, right? He's giving us a myth. And the myth communicates reality, and the reality is, for Lewis, it is the triune God of Christianity with whom we have to do. It is because He is the answer. Now, how did Orwell reach these conclusions? Well, number one, by her unveiling. So again, remember, in the story, Orwell is the veiled queen. Through the story, in all of her endeavors, she is continually veiled. And now you see where the title, Till We Have Faces, comes from. But at the end of the story, when she finally has an audience with the judge, something important in the story happens. She is unveiled. And in a vision, she comes before the gods, and particularly the judge. And this is what is said about her. Uncover her, said the judge. Hands came from behind me, Orwell reflects, and tore off my veil. And notice, not only my veil, but after it, every rag I had on. The old crone with her ungate face stood naked before those countless gazers. No thread to cover me, though bowl in my hand to hold the water of death, only my book. Read your complaint, said the judge. Now, Orwell, for the first time in the story, is not only unveiled, but she is completely unclothed. Everything about her is exposed. And this is a picture of the reality that when we stand before God, our very intentions of our heart and mind are exposed. Everything is exposed to Him as an open book. This unveiling, right, is humbling. Any pride that Orwell had has now been stripped away. She is unveiled. And it continues. There was utter silence all around me. And now, for the first time, I knew what I had been doing. And now the self-realization, right, as she stands completely exposed. I knew what I had been doing. While I was reading her complaint, it had once and again seemed strange to me that the reading took so long, for the book was a small one. Now I knew that I had been reading it over and over, perhaps a dozen times. I would have read it forever, quick as I could, starting the first word again almost before the last was out of my mouth, if the judge had not stopped me. And the voice I read it in was strange to my ears. There was given to me a certainty that this, at last, was my real voice. And notice, so she has been exposed. The judge said, read your complaint. She begins to read it and read it and read it. But the more that she reads it, she becomes convinced. I now hear my real voice. I now know the real me. And it says, there was silence in the dark assembly, long enough for me to have read my book out again. And at last the judge spoke. Are you answered? Yes, said I. And then the books are closed. Now, what happened here? Orwell came face to face with her supreme disordered passions. As she continued to read her complaint, the more she read it, the more that she realized that she had no substantial basis for this complaint. She had misunderstood. She was selfish. She was disordered. And she had no right to lodge these complaints. Thus, she is as the babbling fool. She is as the babbling fool. Now, how does this help us? Well, number one, there is a general appeal to divine mystery here. What happened here, Orwell does not get the kind of answer that we think we need. And when we think about the problem of evil, and even the question of pointless suffering and those sorts of things, one way we can begin to answer this, and I think this is not a cop-out, is this, that there is a genuine mystery to it. We can appeal to divine mystery. I don't know why. But here's the reality. If that is not satisfying to us, we would logically then, to lodge a complaint against God, have to have the mind of God to be able to know exactly why this was purposed. So we can appeal to divine mystery. I don't know why, but I know God is good, powerful, loving. I don't know. But it could be answered for me later. So there's a general and genuine appeal to divine mystery. We don't have to know the answer, right? Secondly, we do see in response to the problem of evil that there are soul-making aspects to the problem of evil. And that is exactly what happens with Orwell. As she lodges this complaint and comes to find out the answer to her complaint, she realizes that she is selfish. And that she has not really loved Psyche, or her kingdom, or her sisters, or her friends. Or if you read the story of Bardia himself, because she becomes very jealous about Bardia's faithfulness to his wife. So she is humbled. These are the soul-making aspects of the problem of evil, that we grow when we suffer. Third thing is that we see here the unveiling of human nature. The reality is that we're not as good as we think we are sometimes. right? That we have a certain assumptions about the way things should go. And that's why I think in this book, Orwell realizes that she's a babbling fool with a deceptive heart. How many times are we like babbling fools with deceptive hearts? In her unveiling, she found out how self-deceived she was. And that too, I think, is a major component in answering these kinds of questions. But I think God being the answer is a very powerful one, because it answers the question of longing. It answers the question of a desire for completion. And when we suffer in this world, we long for that resolution. But nothing short of a God who is infinite, eternal, and unchanging can really bring that sort of satisfaction. And I think there's something to this, that all questions die before the face of God. This is what we see in Job, for example. God appears to Job. And when God appears to Job, Job does not question. Even though throughout the entirety of Job, in the discussions that he has with his friend, there's a lot of questions. But in Job 40, verse 4, it says, Then Job answered the Lord and said, Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Right? To me, this is lovely. To me, this is lovely. For Job, we could seriously conclude that the reason why God does not give Job an answer is because he is the answer to Job. Right? And so it is for us that when we suffer and we have these questions about divine hiddenness, where God is and how all of this evil can seemingly be reconciled with this God that we serve, well, why does he not answer? Well, because he is the answer, right? And here I have a quote from Thomas Boston, who is a 17th into 18th century Scottish theologian. And he says this, Why will ye toil so to bring out of the creatures what is not in them? Nothing but God himself is commensurable to the desires of the soul. Notice that. Nothing but God himself is commensurable to the desires of the soul. No man ever saw or will see an end of his desires till they are swallowed up in God himself. Now, for the very same reason that the proponents of the problem of evil reject belief in God, that if God is all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing, are the very same reasons why we conclude that our desires are not ultimately met until we have God, because he is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. So these attributes end up becoming the very thing that grounds our need for him. And if we try to find resolution in anything less than him, we will never be satisfied. The problem of evil will never be answered. And I think Boston is right that not only is God the answer, but until our desires are swallowed up in God himself, then we will not have satisfaction. And the reality is, as Lewis would argue, is that we are a soul-body creature. And the longings of our soul could not be found in anything that is not infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. This is why the soul longs for God. But when our desires are swallowed up in him, then we are satisfied. Our longing is complete. Thus, the God of the mountain, as we are to take, is indeed all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing. Now that brings us to number 5. Again, the question, do the gods know what it is like to be man? Well, yes, from a Christian perspective. We read in Hebrews 4:15, For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. So Christian theology certainly advocates that God knows what it is like to be man. The incarnate Son of God, Jesus Christ. He indeed came into this world. He was humbled coming into this world. He lived under the law of God and was subject to the infirmities of this world, but yet he himself was without sin. He understands what it means So we have a high priest, the Bible says, who can sympathize with our weaknesses. And finally, playing off the title, Till We Have Faces, right? The idea here is that Orwell is veiled. And it is not until she is unveiled, where she comes face to face with God, that she understands the nature of her situation. But even in the Bible, we see, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13:12, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. And here's the key. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, just as I also am known. I think it's intentional. I haven't read any sources that say this per se. This is my thought, but it seems intentional to me that Lewis was purposely incorporating this notion into the story. For now we see in a mirror dimly. We don't yet have the perspective. It's as if we see in a mirror dimly. But then we will see face to face. Orwell comes face to face with the gods, with the judge. And as a result, she may really well say, now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I am also known. And in the unveiling of Orwell, she comes to know herself as she is known, as selfish, prideful, misunderstanding the situation, disordered heart and passions. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the imagery given of how Orwell saw herself as it was a spider web of entanglement. That all of her passions and desires were like in this, were so disordered that all the peoples in her life were like prey in the web of a spider. And her disordered love for them was preying upon them. Bardia, Psyche, even her own father who was abusive, her sister, Redival. They were like prey in the web of a spider. She was so disordered. But when she was unveiled, she came to know as she is known. And so I think from Lewis's perspective, and indeed from the Christian perspective, this is one way at getting at the problem of evil and divine hiddenness. Understanding that we do not yet have faces. Understanding that we do not yet have that perspective. Understanding that God does not answer because He Himself is the answer. And fundamentally understanding this, that's what we need. We don't need God to answer us, but we need Him. And if He is the answer, that is the only thing that will satisfy the longing heart, who in light of suffering longs for resolution.